The greatest bulwark against the state isn't online activists, but rather powerful local families that have both the means and skin in the game to resist foreign power. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today I have Tho Bishop, the author of that excellent quote. He is the assistant editor at the Mises Institute. Mr. Bishop, if people want to find your collection of work, where is the best place to go?
Yeah, you can find my author page at Mises.org. Just about everything I publish is on there right now.
What is Paleolibertarianism?
So Paleolibertarianism was a deliberate strategy promoted by Murray Rothbard, Lew Rockwell, Justin Raimondo, and others in the 90s that kind of recognized two important things. For one, at the time there, obviously this was a post-Cold War political environment, and they recognized that the boogeyman of the Soviet Union, which not to belittle obviously the horrific nature of that regime, but that had long been used as the justification for the expansion of the American empire and for a hawkish foreign policy, which itself translated in a variety of domestic sins. And alongside of that, it was about 20 years after really a true American libertarian movement. If you think, as Rothbard fans, you think about For a New Liberty, which is a great book, but what Rothbard and Rockwell, in part guided by the experience of Ron Paul as a libertarian candidate in the 80s, they recognized that the people who identified as libertarian were not as good as the ideas of libertarians. And so the paleo strategy was an explicit outreach to the right, particularly the paleo conservatives and the Pat Buchanan mold, as well as a deliberate attempt to distance themselves from the libertarian movement as they saw it in the 90s.
There is an excellent article which you have republished called, I believe it's called The Case for Paleolibertarianism by Lew Rockwell. In there, he says briefly, Paleolibertarianism with its roots in the old right sees 10 things. Let's go over these 10 things. Please explain to me why each one of these is of importance that we should appreciate. Number one, the Leviathan state as an institutional source of evil throughout history.
I think that is something that, that's kind of a broad point sort of libertarian perspective, but I think in this case, it's also important in that trying to tap into those old right traditions, because in particular, kind of harkening back to the anti-no deal coalition. And that's one of the things I think is so interesting in both the work of Rothbard and Rockwell is their appreciation for American political history. And one of my favorite articles, Strategy for the Right, Rothbard outlines how this old right perspective, a lot of the framing of the dangers of the administrative state, the Leviathan state, were, libertarians had an outsized impact on that relative that movement. So this kind of a, acknowledgement of the state as an anti-civilizational tool.
Number two, the unhampered free market as a moral and practical imperative.
Yes, and this is one of, again, still at this point, and I think the first 6 or 7 are kind of things are getting general libertarian ideas. But of course, this is important, particularly in this period, this framing, because of the right outreach, where the skepticism of the market sometimes works against some of the perhaps end goals of conservatives.
There is a great chapter in Pat Buchanan's book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. I think it's sarcastically titled Man of the Century, about Winston Churchill. And he says, he cites that May 11th, 1940 was the day that Britain basically engaged in some of the most barbarous, heinous acts when they started to try and win the war by focusing on civilian targets. It was all thought up by a guy named Frederick Lindemann. So far from moral degeneracy being the result of free markets, private property, voluntary exchange, and families, it's the state where people are so blinded by the belief in political authority and the erroneous hatred of the, quote, enemy that they're able to justify things they would otherwise see as blatantly illegitimate. So I think Buchanan is such a great ally when it comes to showing that the state is the enemy of morality and civilization rather than the free market. Are there any things you focus on when communicating to conservatives why the free market is something they should appreciate when it comes to wanting to live moral and civil lives?
Well, one of the important things right now is I think that we're kind of on the defensive because of, when conservatives talk about, like particularly right now and some of the interesting intellectual spheres when you're right, I mean, they will attack the word capitalism in much the same way the left will, as kind of using that as a description of the current state. And I think that one of the priorities, and I think this is not only, I think, an important theoretical point, obviously, and an improved way of properly understanding the world as it exists, but also a strategic point, that we have to highlight the degree, particularly what the objections out there are also, for example, right now, the corporate consolidation of power, big tech, the BlackRock and things like that. And so highlighting that a lot of their complaints about big business, about these monopolies and things like that, are not the product, the result of a free market. That some of these trade, the trade arrangements that have risen since the 90s are not free trade, but government managed trade, which is why Rothbard and Buchanan were allies on NAFTA and others. But really, the consequences of global of financialization and the role of the Fed, and the disconnect of sound money as being a major benchmark that if you politicize the size of an inch and you try to build houses, I mean, that's going to create some issues, and it's kind of the same way that we have the issue with fiat currency and the economy as it exists today. So trying to engage in a meaningful way, often it's a game of semantics. And so, but it's the problem is that if we get frustrated and throw up our hands and don't engage on this issue, then not only does it prevent us from working with people like Pat Buchanan that have a proper understanding of the dangers of the American empire and Pax Americana, but also it will necessarily make whatever the American right and whatever power it has less libertarian by simply lacking any serious engagement on these things too. So I think this is the key area of intellectual discussion that why paleo-libertarians in particular are so important, because I think we're the only ones that can kind of communicate on common cassag sheet.
I think that's so vitally important. So while the conservatives are absolutely right about big tech being more or less a criminal syndicate at this point, the U.S. government just seized 22 websites the other day, including presstv.com. So it's not that should we have a free market where bad things happen or a political system instead of having bad things. No, bad things are going to happen. Under which system would you rather those bad things occur? At least in the free market, you have some competition and lower barriers to entry. So yeah, excellent point about the big tech conglomerates there. Point number.
The issues kind of on that too. I just one point on top of that, though, is that and because even though the one problem we have on the right is that, okay, like we can agree that this is an issue. The problem is that then they'll kind of pick up like any big stick sort of approach, and because big tech's the problem, they'll kind of justify. I think that's one of the really interesting thing about Rothbard's analysis. Say like Teddy Roosevelt, who's one of those populist figures that the American right, there's kind of a resurrection of kind of bull moose or Teddy populism. And some of that's just aesthetic, right? Teddy Roosevelt does admittedly have kind of this macho aesthetic, which is I understand that's popular. But ultimately, what the lessons are there is, I mean, what Teddy Roosevelt, when he was busting trust, he wasn't he wasn't taking out centers of power. He was taking out his rival centers of power. And so again, like once you understand the corruptive nature of the empire itself, and particularly if you're a cultural conservative and you don't recognize the degree to which the federal levels of power are never going to be wielded to our advantage. I mean, I think that it also highlights the importance of we don't want to give further power to the enemy of DC simply because we're chasing after the enemies of Silicon Valley. That's why I think like the Ron DeSantis approach in Florida, some of these utilizing state levers to apply pressure is a much better approach there. And so again, that's why why this battleground is so important. It's also why libertarians need to engage with it honestly rather than kind of retreating to easy talking points.
Exactly. Point number 3 by Lou Rockwell: private property as an economic and moral necessity for a free society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a little bit, I think it goes back to the point, right, you mentioned earlier, is that, when you have the empire approaching upon property rights on, whether it's in the digital landscape there in terms of websites and things like that, or again, that kind of even plays into some of the arguments about banning profiles on social media. Property rights are a strong protection of property rights gives you institutions that can push back against the prevailing zeitgeist of the day. And obviously, given where the cultural levers of power are right now, again, if you are, even if you are an American conservative without any sort of sympathies to libertarianism as a Finland philosophy, you should appreciate that you are in the minority when it comes to levers of power. That's when appreciation of property rights, a failure to appreciate property rights is suicidal.
Point number 4, the garrison state as a preeminent threat to liberty and social well-being.
Yes, and I think this is particularly interesting right now because we're in a period right now of the war on domestic terror. Glenn Greenwald, among others, have been great chronicles of this change of the Biden administration. And even though kind of the arguments are passed about standing armies and things like that, this can feel antiquated at times. What we're seeing now is federal use of grant programs to local law enforcement as a means of trying, and of course, the more that the federal government places its fingerprint on local law enforcement, the greater consequence that has when you think of kind of prevailing grassroots movements with nullification laws and things like that. You want law enforcement, if you're going to have a body dedicated to law enforcement and property protection of property rights, you want it to be made up of those in the community, not those allied to a district capital.
Point number 5, the welfare state as organized theft that victimizes producers and eventually even its clients.
And this is something that I think it was a focal point that's important because that used to be a very common held tradition with the old right. And of course, I think you see this explicitly now, there's this rising economic populist argument that will try to make conservative defenses of the welfare state. Of course, I think one of the things that makes this a little bit different than the 90s is living in an inflationary environment, because we've lived in a period of consistent improvement of material well-being for a variety of different reasons. Once that changes, we move into an inflationary environment, a lot of the considerations of the right economically go out the window once you start feeling real consequences to welfare programs and the like.
Point number 6, civil liberties based on property rights as essential to a just society.
Yeah, and I think the key there is the grounding it in property rights, rather sort of abstract nature of civic rights, which is kind of the religion of the empire. So the wording there I think is very important.
Point number 7, the egalitarian ethic as morally reprehensible and destructive of private property and social authority.
And this is when, within the article, Lou mentions that this is an area where some libertarians are disagreeing, and understandably so, and I think importantly so. And I think this kind of gets the goal. This is why, recently in conversations with Dave Smith and others, the conversation can kind of be like watered down into the Republican Party versus the Libertarian Party. For me, my underlying, to me, those are the consequences of kind of a larger belief I have, which is being a liberty movement as a unified kind of thing, has been counterproductive precisely because of the disagreements on these next 3 points here. I think show a significant disagreement in what should a society be if after the state, and of course the rejection of egalitarianism as a romantic ideal or an aim, obviously reflected in a must-read article in Rothbard's Egalitarianism as a revolt against nature, but also something that is very baked into like the worldview of Ludwig von Mises and others. And so again, this is where you start getting the fun cultural differences within the libertarian movement.
Sure. And Rothbard's excellent point in that book, the collection of essays, Egalitarianism as Revolt Against Nature, he says that, it might be a little confusing seeing presidents and the most powerful people on earth talking about equality. Like, you and I are so unequal. Me and, Boris Johnson at the G7, the need for equality. You're a million times more powerful than I'll ever be. And he says, this is a brilliant tactic because it's not only undefinable, but it's unachievable under any system: fascism, syndicalism, capitalism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. So the existence of a lack of equality justifies further egalitarian legislation, which justifies more and more and more. And it just is I think the term is self-licking ice cream cone, is how it's like you invade a country, mess things up, and say, well, look how bad things are. We need to really step it up in here. So again, this happens. Point number 8, social authority as embodied in the family, church, community, and other intermediating institutions as helping protect the individual from the state and as necessary for the free and a virtuous society.
Absolutely, and this kind of gets to the point that you opened, the comment I was getting, that you quoted at the beginning of the episode, is that there's no greater defense against the state. It's not simply the levers of power and the raw brutality of the fists of government, but there's also a cultural zeitgeist baked in, and it requires self-sustaining, strong networks to withstand that. And of course, we are not hyper atomized individuals. We are born into families. We are born into communities. We are born into language groups and religions, and all of these aspects that human society is so much deeper than simply our political viewpoints. And again, this is something that it's something that I think is very telling when you see some libertarians, for example, Nick Lespin. I'm not trying to take a cheap shot, but like in the past, he has explicitly defined his view of libertarianism as the promotion of alternative lifestyles. And of course, that's something that would be, that is not the way that, say, Ludwig von Mises, the man of old Europe, would be defining a liberalism properly understood. And I again, goes to some of the cultural differences there.
Yeah, it almost has this critical theory approach of alternative lifestyles. So in other words, if we convince everyone of self-ownership, non-aggression, and private property, libertarianism would then mean an alternative to the current practicing of voluntary exchanges and voluntary contracts. There's nothing to even sink your teeth into with that Gillespie definition.
Well, and it's also reflecting, this is one of the biggest changes that I've had in thinking about the concept of liberty itself over the last couple of years, is that, for one, I mean, obviously there's something that about individualism that I think attracts a lot of people, and it's something exciting, particularly when young, and it's fun to be bold and anti-authoritarian. All those are great things. I'm not dismissing all of that, but especially this last year has really come to me, is that liberty is not an individual value. It is necessarily a collective value.
Yeah.
A sovereign man in a tyrannical regime, doesn't have a lot of freedom. But being a member of a society that values freedom as an end, that is what actually allows you to live free, not simply, argue about who's the most libertarian person in, an Amazon gulag, right? That's the difference there.
Sure. That's why I love that image of individualism and collectivism. In the individual, they're shaking hands, and the collectivists, their hands are cuffed and they're being forced to shake. So it's not everyone does their own thing. As Henry Hazlitt said, you can't even make a pencil by yourself. Right. You can't even come close. So therefore, we're all in this together. We want to do so on a voluntary, peaceful, private property ethic basis. Yes, I think that's a vitally important point for us to appreciate. Number 9, Western culture as eminently worthy of preservation and defense.
Yes, and this is obviously a pushback against in any sort of from what it's a recognition of the degree to which liberty was a uniquely Western virtue, and from that extrapolated what was a direct byproduct of Christian culture. And again, this is true regardless of your view on the theology involved. It is undoubtedly true that the culture that evolved in the West grounded in Judeo-Christian values, and that's Ralph Rako's work on what made the West, the European miracle and the like. There's also it's a very this is another area where my views have changed in the last few years with a full appreciation of the debt that we owe from that Western Christian legacy, regardless of your religious views.
Have you read, gosh, it's been so long. I think it's Tom Woods' book, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization.
I've not read that one in particular. I have read Rothbard's History of Economic Thought, which pays a lot of, which acknowledges the contributions of the Catholic Church within that. And currently now, based off of the recommendation of Matt Erickson, I'm reading Tom Holland's Dominion, which provides, of course, a proper historical context for just how revolutionary the example of Christ was, and that's has been a fascinating read. But it's something I remember a few years ago at the Institute during our research conference. Danny Ajamian gave a wonderful talk on the cost of the Enlightenment, which was one of the most radical things I've ever seen at the Institute, which is saying a lot. And that really even kind of questioned, sort of the classical sort of liberal framework there. If anyone out there, if you're interested in this topic, that talk is something I'd highly recommend.
Oh yeah, well, it's we need to learn the lessons that we're constantly saying. With everything, there are costs and benefits. Even the guy Theodore John Kaczynski was talking about all the costs of the Industrial Revolution and how it can lead to people not being in families and communities and feeling that the whole world is on their shoulders alone. They don't have people to lean on. So yeah, there's cost to everything. One thing about Western civilization, Stefan Molyneux, the philosopher, said that doubt is the one thing that makes Western civilization unique, going back to Socrates, willing to question fundamental ideas, scientists willing to question the Pope's authority, separation of church and state. I think you're going to go to hell if you don't believe what I believe, but I'm not positive, so I'm still going to let you be free. Do you see doubt as what makes Western civilization unique and worthy of preservation?
That's an interesting concept. I think there's something to be said there. I must admit, I'm not engaged much with Stefan Molyneux's work. That's something I would need to consider with a great deal. I do have an appreciation for the role that risk has played, and I know that the work of Neil Ferguson, in his book on what has made the West the best, plays highlights that as one of the plays, and I think there's a lot of important concepts and abstractions that were able to take a foothold in the Western world because of those underlying cultural values, and I think that the complex network of them all is what allowed for the flourishing of liberty and civilization.
Point number 10, finally, objective standards of morality, especially as found in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as essential to the free and civilized social order.
Yep. And again, this is it's the key of it, and this is often one of the ones, the aspects that is criticized by certain types of libertarians, because this is kind of a pushback against the idea that the nap is enough, right? So is it detrimental, for a conservative Christian family to live next to a bunch of nudists and things like that? The importance of community values for a cohesive society, and I think that again this is one of those fun hot cultural views, and this is also why again I think that a rejection of that as a norm makes it difficult for a liberty movement to result in a cohesive political force. Later in that article, Lou quotes J.K. Chesterton, something to the extent of, we agree on what the evil is, but it is upon the question of what is the good that we claw each other's eyes out. And I think about some of these discussions that have come with Mac Erickson and some of the others within sort of this questioning of what this libertarian movement really stands for. And I think a lot of that stems from disagreements on what, where do you expect all this to end? And again, I think that if you recognize the strength of a society grounded in those Judeo-Christian ethics, I think that it, for one, helps you prioritize which issues are out there in terms of outreach, and also makes it a lot easier to identify who those people you should be reaching out to come into be.
Exactly. I really saw this in a post that recently went sort of viral. This was both in the progressive and left libertarian circles. And it was something like, why are people always like, oh, I hope that homeless person doesn't spend the money I give them on drugs or alcohol. Once I give them money, it's not my business anymore. That is only something someone with a totally leftist mindset would say. Are you kidding me? You don't care whether they use it to get a bus ride, to get a job application, or use it. Either crystal meth or job application. They don't have any standards. Whereas you would never hear any Trump, DeSantis, Marjorie Taylor Greene supporters say that. And when you have that kind of worldview, we should really be aligning with the people who at least recognize the difference there.
Right, and again, it comes down to a lot of, I think, libertarians are attracted to the convenient they see libertarianism as a way of kind of justifying life decisions at times. And again, this goes into some of the critiques that Lou and Murray had about the libertarian movement that they watched evolve around them. And that's why I love so much reading the depth of Mises' work, because even though he was a great economist, even though he was a proud and passionate author of classical liberal political thought, ultimately what he was illustrating in a variety of different disciplines was what is required for civilization to thrive. And that requires a lot more than a narrow understanding of the now. That requires a lot more than a belief in laissez-faire economic policy as an end in itself. It requires what allows for us to thrive. And again, the terrifying aspect is that civilization is built by having low time preference, right? Planting trees that our grandkids are going to be able to benefit from, and then a Austro-libertarian framework allows you to fully recognize how structured our institutions are to promote high time preference, short-term behavior. And I think a lot of libertarians, even if they may disagree on the margins, they have no problem reducing human existence down to self-gratification units. And again, I think that's problematic.
Excellent points there. One thing the conservatives are also right about, I think, is the importance of identity. I don't know if you've seen these two top trending stories on Twitter, but one was Demi Lovato comes out as non-binary. Man comes out as Korean. He is no longer British. He identifies as Korean, and after 18 plastic surgeries, will only respond to you calling him Korean. This is such a sad case of people needing an identity, something to feel, something to believe in. I can't imagine kids working in the coal mines saying, I think I'm transgender, I think I'm Korean, and then they're beating away. It's like you would never have time for such bizarre nonsense. Do you think, how do you think libertarians can benefit from recognizing the importance of identity regarding the individual and the community?
Well, I think the community aspect is key to that. One of my favorite talks I saw the Liberty Institute was Jeff Dice's Born a Libertarian talk, where he gets to the point of, what are you willing to fight for? And the problem is, one of the things that libertarians, I think, take for granted is they assume that everyone else kind of thinks like them or has the ability to think like them. And the problem is that a lot of people don't. Like, a lot of people are not motivated by abstract arguments and concerns with hyper-rational, logical consistency. They are motivated by a sense of security, by a sense of pride, by these tribalistic sort of natures there. And there is a bad habit that can arise from strong intellectual traditions to think that the real goal is to kind of improve humanity, have us evolve past these archaic past rituals, like family and tribe and God and all that sort of stuff. And I think that is, that's kind of the underlying dynamic of kind of progressivism, I think, properly understood. And that is something that libertarians could benefit from, some humility in that regard. And I think there's something to be said about kind of the old adage of that paleo movement, that libertarians have a lot to learn from conservatives about culture and what it means to maintain a cohesive society, and while conservatives have a lot to learn from libertarians on economic issues.
Of course. On page 197 of Democracy, the God That Failed, Hans Hoppe says, states everywhere were intent upon breaking down and ultimately destroying families and the institutions and layers and hierarchies of authority that are the natural outgrowth of family-based communities in order to increase and strengthen their own power. What do you think is important for libertarians to recognize the importance of competing authorities to the state's attempted monopoly?
Absolutely. And again, I think this is something as well. I think libertarians have been better on this than most. I think the people that have needed this lesson, and I think have gotten this lesson good and hard, particularly in the past year, are conservatives, particularly with the issues of the public school system. I think that there has been a naivete about just how much the state, particularly at the federal level, the education, there are some differences in the state that do matter. But the degree to which the state is a benevolent actor, and I think that, I'm encouraged at the degree to which the kind of twofold. For one, seeing the fruits of our education system often burning down cities last year with these kind of leftist mobs, coupled with the awakening of the dangers of critical race theory. The more that conservatives recognize that these state institutions are built to undermine their connection to their most important asset, their children. That is one of those ways where a massive change in the way that they view those institutions, considering how many more conservatives there are out there than libertarians. That's something that I think has the potential to do some significant damage to the regime.
There's a number of things that unites people on the, quote, right. And I think this is why we have so much in common with the DeSantis supporters, Trump supporters, Marjorie Taylor Greene supporters, whereas it's extremely difficult to really get along with some of these left libertarians, especially ones you like who are, defending critical race theory, the actual racism that is a big problem in America. So we discussed probably the first main thing that right-wingers have in common, the hatred of egalitarianism, especially egalitarian outcomes. Another thing that connects us is the idea of negative rights, that you are not inherently owed something by others, society, or the state. What do you think? Do you think focusing on negative rights is important?
I think it is. So I think there's and I mean, and one of the useful things is that for all of the other failings of the Constitution, it does make a good rhetorical benchmark. So again, I'm very sympathetic to the views of Lysander Spooner, but if your goal is a rhetorical one to communicate, you being able to ground your viewpoint in the founding fathers as opposed to an anarchist philosopher, definitely has some strength there. But yeah, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, this is why Rothbard's conceived the Liberties series, which kind of a love letter to to the founding of the American tradition, is something that it's very tempting at times for libertarians, I think, to feel that they were above any this kind of, tribal connection. But I think grounding that, particularly given the advantage that we have as Americans in that heritage, makes it a whole lot easier to do outreach with the right. And again, if your goal is forming formidable political alliances, I mean, I think that is an obvious common ground there.
Thomas Sowell said something that connects the right is the constrained view of the world, which is the moral limitations of human beings, in particular, their egocentricity, self-centeredness, and selfishness, are accepted as inherent facts of life. The challenge is to make the best of the possibilities that exist within that constraint, rather than waste energy trying to change human nature, along with things like, admiration of strength and achievement. Do you see the conflict of visions or the constrained view as something that should be appreciated, or is that more of an intellectual thing we don't exactly need to harp on with conservatives?
No, I think that and for one, there's always different degrees of conversation you can have. But I think this does go to an important point in highlighting some of those differences that exist within libertarian ranks, which is important in your outreach to the right, because again, that is a rejection of that sort of progressive nature, your progressive view of humanity as something fixable. You're recognizing that we're living in a fallen world, and that the plans, perhaps made with the best of intentions, will be abused by. If there's ability for them to be corrupted and abused, people will find means to do so. And that is a level of humility. If taken at face value, it provides a level of humility that most progressives or people that have this very revolutionary view have to reckon with.
What is the most important thing you learned from or contribution of Lew Rockwell?
I consider Lew Rockwell to be one of the indispensable men of the ideas of civilization. Him as a writer, I mean, he's such an eloquent, beautiful, and substantive writer. He writes with this level of gratitude that I think is really kind of key to sort of that kind of the Mises Institute sort of aesthetic tradition in a lot of ways. I mean, the way that he just celebrates figures like Mises and Rothbard and never puts the attention on himself. But also, I mean, but more importantly than that is the role of Lew as a system builder, as an institution builder. And this is one of the things I love about sort of Mises Institute type. There's a lot of our material that kind of looks at the development of intellectual movements and the role that institutions play and that allow ideas to really sustain and be kept alive and spread and thrive and evolve. And the fact that Lew Rockwell was able to build an institution that has lasted almost 40 years to the dedication of the ideas of Ludwig von Mises in the Austrian school is truly incredible. And then that's why, like, anybody out there, again, if there's articles of Lew that's written that you disagree with, if you care at all about liberty, if you care at all about Mises or Roth or any of that, and you're not grateful for the work that Lew has, then you don't deserve the ideas of Mises and Rothbard. Like, that's, he's done it.
Most important thing you learned from Ludwig von Mises?
Courage. We are so lucky. I mean, Louis von Mises may be the greatest intellectual figure of human history as far as I'm concerned, but even greater than any single book that he's had. I mean, there's a lot to be said about. I mean, this praxeology as a means of understanding human society beyond narrowly economics. I think, you know, and I think one of the untapped gold mines out there for intellectual output is greater investment in non-economic praxeological sort of analysis out there. So there's so much you could go down there for. But I think the best book that we have in the Mises bookstore is not Human Action. It's you know, Nothing by Ron Paul or Tom Woods. I think it's the biography of Louis von Mises, because his life, the way that he lived his life, I think makes his ideas all the more incredible and something you used to take all the more seriously. And so the ability of standing athwart history, no matter the cost or the stakes, that as much as any theoretical concept is something inspiring.
Most important thing you learned from Murray and Rothbard?
Questioning the historical narrative. I think that, again, brilliant economist, brilliant political theorist, and honestly, I'll say the fact that you have, I'm going to take that back. So the historical narrative part is very important. His revisionist work on history is something I highly recommend. But even perhaps greater than that was the recognition that if you truly hate the state, that is not enough. You have to understand the state and the makeup of the state. And the fact that you had someone of his intellectual achievement and capability that was not content with simply being an ivory tower intellectual, but rather seriously engaged with the question of strategy, of ideological warfare, that is it is precisely that gets him attacked by, you know, scholars and cushy tenure jobs that aren't particularly worried about their livelihood. But I think that, as much as anything else, sets him apart, and something that, you know, obviously has been a tremendous influence on me. And I think that's his best work.
Most important thing you learned from Hans Hermann Hoppe? The power of controversy. I think that there's a lot of great insights that Hoppe has brought to the table, but I think it is incredible that he is able to drive his enemies so crazy in spite of the fact that he's not on social media, right? Like, you know, there's this mystique of him because, you know, he's living in a 5-star hotel, and, you know, he only graces us from the clouds once a year with PFS and an occasional Mises event. You know, the fact that he's able just to write a deep intellectual piece, but just, you know, with these little jabs that will just drive his enemies crazy. I think that that's one of the reasons why he's had this kind of resurrected interest in spite of. There's no reason Hoppe should be as the meme that he is, right? And and he is precisely because of his ability to stir controversy. I love. I think it's a fascinating intellectual phenomenon. It's for everything else, that's something I love. One of my favorite things that Hoppe gives us at the end of Democracy, the God That Failed, is his thinking behind why old school conservative, small government, classical liberal ideas have not succeeded. So here are a few quotes from the final chapters of The God That Failed. Liberalism's central and monumentous error lies in its theory of government. It is impossible to derive a justification for government from explicit contracts between private property owners. Once the premise of government is accepted, liberals, classical liberals, are left without argument when socialists try to pursue this premise. Without moral argument at his disposal, a liberal is left only with the tool of cost-benefit analysis, but any such analysis must involve interpersonal comparison of utility, such comparisons are impossible, scientifically impermissible. Liberals will have to recognize no government can be contractually justified. I just love that from Lou, where he says that we sort of give them too much wiggle room, the socialists. So that's why I'm not surprised when I see Lindsey Graham next to Benjamin Netanyahu holding a sign that says "More for Israel." Well, why not more? Why not help people? What's wrong with the government doing a thing to help a group? If you buy into government, you, of course, would believe such nonsense like that. Well, finally, I want to ask you what you think libertarians can learn from the successful campaigns of Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, and Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Well, I think there's some different ones between all three. I think in the case of Trump, it is the degree to which a large percentage of this country distrusts the center institutions of all stripes. I mean, Trump first and foremost is a repudiation of the Republican Party. Then he was a repudiation of the uniparty consensus of what respectful politics is supposed to look like, and the degree to which the point I've made in the past is that Trump in many ways is the anti-Reagan. Both Reagan and Trump both had great campaign rhetoric. Both Reagan and Trump had, at best, imperfect records in the presidency. The difference is, though, is that Reagan convinced conservatives to trust the institutions that hated conservative America, whereas Trump has awakened conservative America to the degree to which these institutions hate them. And that is something that if you're a libertarian and don't recognize the value at play when you have 50+ million Republicans that know that the Joe Biden administration is illegitimate. I mean, this is the best opportunity we've ever had. And I think that's really understanding the lessons of anatomy of the state there when you understand the degree to which federal power depends upon the perception of legitimacy. In terms of Ron DeSantis, his successful campaign was an illustration of the power of Trump as a political force, but I think the success of his governorship goes to the degree to which some Republicans are waking up to the nature of the cathedral, as that has been popularized of late. Because ultimately, the reason why he is the leading figure of the Republican Party post-Trump today is him standing up to the public policy experts in Fauci, standing up to the corporate press, standing up to universities, which has been one of the strengths of this legislative session. And so actually really dealing with the serious power structures rather than the facade of ceremonial democracy at the federal level. In the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think it is the degree to which the Trump model scaled. Again, Marjorie Taylor Greene is not a perfect libertarian. I don't think she wants to legalize recreational cocaine tomorrow, but she questions the narrative in important ways. She's attacked warmongers. She has attacked the neocons. She has attacked many of those same enemies that Trump had, which are the same enemies that libertarians should have. And if you don't have those enemies, that's time for some self-reflection. And so I think the Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Matt Gaetzes, though they are obvious allies for those who recognize the biggest threat to liberty is the centralized power of the regime properly understood, rather, and that the best hope that we have politically within the American perspective is kind of a war, is a movement of national liberation away from that centralized, isolated power. And I think that stands in contrast to the more revolutionary mindset of wanting Ancapistan or say, I think that there are means to achieve a more radical libertarian society, but those are going to be exits from the current political regime rather than some sort of grand revolution within the political regime. Again, I'm all for seasteading. I'm all for special economic zones. I'm all for turning Honduras into Gulf Gulch, whatever. But if you're interested in American politics in a way of creating perhaps not the libertarian idea, but something a little more free, there's something to be learned from Trump, DeSantis, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, the whole ranks.
Couldn't agree more. On it was the day that the election was given to Biden, that there was this huge protest outside of the Arizona Capitol, and I remember thinking, they all think that the government is going to be illegitimate. I need to get down there. So I put on my black and yellow flag because I got to stand out somehow. And I went down there. I could not get people to stop talking to me about the black and yellow flag. People asked me for my podcast, whereas the average podcaster trying to compete in this field is like really trying to push themselves out there. People are like, oh, please write it down, I want to make sure, can I find it on alternative sites, because YouTube is Twitter banned Trump and is going to ban Trump, and this is ridiculous. So I think you're so right on with that being very unique territory for us to really appreciate and make the most of. Any final thoughts on paleo-libertarianism while we close out?
I mean, the beauty of it is that, I simply, am building off the shoulders of far greater men. And, it's been exciting to see people like yourself interested in pursuing, what I think is really a great, deep well of serious libertarian thought. And, I think it is a time, an idea that once again time has come, and at the very least, I think that it is healthy to have a libertarian movement. We're all not sharing the same bumper sticker slogans, and so again, this has been a fun period of time, and I look forward to publishing more Triple R and providing some original content about this current age.
Thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Bishop, thank you so much for your time. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Keith.